All right, we are ready to study the book of Haggai. This is one of the shortest of the minor prophets. One writer has said the book is alive, not with the rolling grandeur of Nahum or the color of Hosea, but with practicality. And indeed, that is the case. As always, let's give some introductory information that'll be helpful. Some of that is in your questions, and we'll get to that in just a moment. In fact, let's go ahead and get question number 1 and 2 and 3. Let's get those out of the way, and then we'll go to our introductory information. To which nation did Haggai prophesy? I'm sorry? Judah. Yeah, it was the nation of Judah as they have returned in the post-exile period. And so the remnant, he prophesies to them. When did he prophesy? About 520 BC. We can be pretty specific about that, according to chapter 1 and verse 1, because of the date that's given there. So 520 BC. We'll get to that a little bit later. And then the message or the theme, question 3. All right, he does deal with obedience and disobedience. Rebuilding the temple, that was where they had failed. And so the thrust and the message of the book is rebuilding the temple. Let's talk about the man Haggai. What little we know about him. We know very little about the man. His name means festive or festival or joyous one. He was likely, we don't know for sure, born in Babylon and then returned to the homeland in the first group. You remember they went away in groups, that there was a first group taken, a second group, and then the final group in the temple was destroyed. And when they came back and returned, they came back in groups, came back in 3 different groups. In the first group that came back under the leadership of Joshua and Zerubbabel, which are mentioned in verse 1, by the way, included in that group was Haggai. We'll say more about that, timing of that in just a moment. He is surmised by some. I don't think there is strong evidence, but it's possible he could have been a priest. Some infer from chapter 2, verse 10 through 19, as he talks about the priest, that some have implied, that's not a necessary inference, but some have implied he may have been a priest himself. I'll leave it at that possible. We have no real strong evidence. You might want to turn over to the book of Ezra just for a moment. He's in the historical section, though Ezra and Nehemiah fit in this post-exile period. Now, we'll say more about the post-exile period a little bit later. But Ezra 5 and Ezra 6 mention the prophet Haggai. And so we see at chapter 5, verse 1, the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, prophets prophesied to the Jews, etc., and mention Zerubbabel and Joshua, the leaders. We'll say who they were and what their role was in just a moment. Let's go to chapter 6, beginning at verse 14. This still in this same time period, at verse 14, we read again that as the temple was completed, this is the completion of the work that we're seeing discussed in the book of Haggai, that the temple was finished, verse 15 said, on the 3rd day in the 4th month, in the 6th year of the king reigned Darius. But anyway, Haggai is mentioned at verse 14. So he's mentioned in Ezra 2 times, and that's about the extent of what knowledge we have of the man Haggai, other than what we see in the book of him being a true prophet, a faithful prophet, one who preached the word, that kind of thing we deduce from the book itself. All right, let's talk about some background information that is important for us to understand what the thrust of the book is. Judah has been in captivity, had been in captivity for 70 years. And now we have the return. And so we have talked about the return in Ezra and Nehemiah, but said very little about the return in the minor prophets. Here's some dates that you may want to remember. In 549 BC, these are BC dates, and remember BC dates go backwards, meaning the higher the number, the further back it is. In 549 BC, Cyrus, king of Persia, defeated the Median king and united those empires, forming the Medo-Persian Empire. So we often talk about the Persian Empire, and then we talk about the Medo-Persian. You say, well, what? Well, it's when they formed this this alliance, and they united the empires. We have the Medo-Persian Empire. In 539 BC, what we have happened there in 539, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, let his son Belshazzar, mentioned in Daniel 5, rule while he was away. And during that period, Cyrus came in and took the city. And so Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 BC. In 536, actually 538, the decree was given in 538 BC, 1 year after Cyrus became ruler over the Babylonian region, what had been under the rule of Babylon. He gave the decree that they could return. The Jews could return from reading of the prophet Isaiah. He was mentioned by name, by the way, in the prophet Isaiah. In 536 BC, that's 70 years from 606 when they first went into captivity. So there's your 70 years. So in 536 BC, the first group of exiles returned. When they came back, they laid the foundation of the temple, and then they quit, and the work ceased. Cyrus is now gone by the time they get to this point, and now we have Cambyses, the next Persian ruler, who then puts a stop to that and demanded that they stop, and they did. Now, Ezra is in that group that comes back in 536. In 534, the work stopped 2 years later. They worked for 2 years and the work stopped. In 520 is when Haggai prophesies. And you say, how did you get 520? Look at chapter 1 and verse 1. This is in the 6th year of Darius and in the first month. That's 520 BC. And so again, we had Cyrus, who reigned from 559 to 529, Cambyses, who reigned from 529 to 522, and Darius the first reigned from 522 to 486. So it was under his rule, that Persian ruler, that Haggai comes and prophesies. Now they've been back 16 years. That's important. They've been back in the land 16 years. They laid the foundation and the temple is still in ruins. They haven't got any further, and that's what the book rebukes them about. In 516, we saw in the book of Ezra a moment ago, chapter 6, the temple was finished. And so if you want more to make a marginal note, go over to Ezra chapter 6. This passage we just mentioned here a minute ago, Ezra chapter 6, 14 to 16, is where we get the idea that it was finished in 516 BC. Make sense so far? So when Ezra comes on the scene, the opening scene is if this were a play. When the curtain opens in in Haggai 1 and verse 1, we're at 520 BC. That's where we are. They've been there 16 years. And you look around in Jerusalem and the temple foundation is laid, but nothing has been done. Nothing has been done for 14 years at least. All right. Now, let's talk about the date. 520 we've already given evidence of that. The book covers approximately 4 months span. Now, some books will cover hundreds of years sometimes in just a few chapters. We only have 2 chapters here and it covers about 4 months. So if you want to take note of this and mark this, notice in chapter 1 and verse 1, we have the 6th month and the first day of the month. Jump on over to chapter 1 and in verse 15, and what you have at verse 15 is the 6th month and the 24th day of the month. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Chapter 2 verse 1 mentions the 7th month. And then we have at verse 10, we have again mentioned the 9th month, and then we have the 9th month later mentioned at verse 20. So nearly, not quite, but nearly 4 months, so approximately 4 months is covered in the book, is what we have in these 2 chapters. He is the first prophet after the exile. That makes him also a contemporary with Zechariah. We start Zechariah next time. There's more chapters to Zechariah. We're going to take 2 or 3 weeks to cover that. But Zechariah is a contemporary with Haggai, preaching at the same time in the same kind of work. So we've charted out the minor prophets, the 12 minor prophets. 3 of them are to the north pre-exile, 6 of them are to the south pre-exile, and 3 of these prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are post-exile prophets. The exile is over. They've come back from captivity and they're rebuilding. Make sense? It's where we are. All right. All right. Now here's the message. You might mark and underline, highlight, etc. The one basic message of the book is in chapter 1 and in verse 8. Look at chapter 1 and verse 8. Build the temple. Go to the mountains, bring wood, and build the temple. Say, I want to know what this book is about. Chapter 1, verse 8, underline that. You've got the message of the book. Haggai's come on the scene and said, my job here is to tell you to build the temple. I'm going to tell you why you haven't been building the temple. I'm going to tell you what you're going to have to do to build the temple. I'm going to tell you what you have to do to be blessed by God, but build the temple is his message. But there's also a message of encouragement. Look at chapter 2, verse 4. Be strong, Zerubbabel. Be strong, Joshua. Be strong, remnant. That's an encouragement. You're discouraged. They are discouraged. That's obvious. Chapter 2, verse 3, 2 and 3. What's interesting about the message is the moral and social problems are not dealt with. Unlike other prophets that attack the idolatry, the moral decline, and even the social decline, how they mistreated one another, is not dealt with in this book. It's not saying it wasn't there. That's not his mission. That's not his message. All right. Questions or comments on introductory information before we look at the book now? Short book, one of the shortest, and yet it's full of very practical things. All right, here's 4 things that happen in the book. There is a message, first of all, in chapter 1. The whole chapter is rebuild the temple. We'll subdivide that in a moment. Chapter 2, verses 1 to 9 is a message of consolation about the glory of the temple. Thirdly, there's a message about prosperity. Why there's a lack of prosperity, how you're going to have prosperity. Fourthly, here's assurance about the future. So is Haggai messianic at all? Yes. The answer is yes. How do we know? Haggai is only quoted one time in the New Testament. Only one time. And that's in Hebrews 12. And the application is, chapter 2, and in verse 6 is quoted in Hebrews 12 and 26, which tells me, as he makes application to the Messianic kingdom, that Haggai has to have Messianic sections. Does that make sense? Doesn't mean the whole thing's Messianic. They're Messianic sections. Short book, but they're still Messianic sections. Isaiah is not totally Messianic. There's some things that are not talking about the Messiah. All right. So we'll get to that here in a second. Let's take this first message of rebuilding the temple. For each section, I've found a key verse, and you might want to mark that verse to summarize that section. So let's get underway here with what we have. Let's go to question number 4, summary of chapter 1. What is chapter 1? All right, very good. Been back for 16 years. They've built their own houses and done well with their houses, kind of living in above poverty level, obviously, in their houses. But things are not going well, even financially, for them. And yet the temple is lying in ruins. 3 things happen in this chapter. There's a rebuke, there's a challenge, and then there's a response. Let's start with the rebuke. Verse 1. This is in the 2nd year of the king Darius, in the 6th month of the year, the word of the Lord. By the way, let's stop there just for a moment. Thus saith the Lord, or the word of the Lord came, or God says, is used some, let me find my number on that, 26 times in 36 verses. You think of this short book and how many times in 38 verses, 26 times, there's some reference made, thus saith the Lord, or the Lord says, or God says, or the word of the Lord came. Some equivalent thereof. But anyway, the word came to Zechariah, and he spoke to the, Haggai the prophet spoke to Zerubbabel, who was the governor. He was a a civil leader who was among the people of God. That is, he'd been come back with this. And Joshua, who was the high priest. Not to be confused with Joshua of the book of Joshua. Obviously a different time. And what's interesting is that where does he direct his message and why? He has a message from God, and the first place he goes is to the leaders. He goes to the leaders. Why? Why would you go to the leaders? They have influence for the rest of the people, but in that there's been failure. Reckon where the failure lied? In the leadership. Joshua and Zerubbabel should have led these people to building the temple already. They should have already been doing that. And so he directs the message to them and tells them. Now, at verse 2, this is interesting. Thus says the Lord of hosts, saying, the people say the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. In other words, Haggai says, here's what the people are saying. It's not time to build. Why they said that, we're not told. There may be a number of reasons why. And some have surmised opposition from the nations around. Nehemiah talks about that opposition from outside and from within. There's Sanballat to the north and Sanballat to the south. And that's a little bit later, but nonetheless, there is this opposition around. Maybe the opposition. The king had stopped the work, by the way, but the kings had changed by this point. 2 years prior to this, the king had changed. And so they don't have that king in power anymore. Some have thought they were waiting for 70 years from 586 when it was destroyed. And the 70 years is not, in the 70 years from the time they went into captivity, the first group has expired. But not 70 years since the temple was destroyed. Some thought maybe, some scholars have speculated, they were waiting for 70 years. At the end of 70 years, it's not time yet. 70 years hadn't expired from 586. Others have thought perhaps that they're just not doing what their excuse was. It's not time to do this for the simple reason that we don't have the means for doing this right now. And perhaps other reasons may be given, but that's all a matter of speculation. Why, we're not told. So now then at verse 4, the word of the Lord came to him, and what do we see at verses 4 and 5? Y'all are saying it's not time, but God says, now he raises this question, is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses and the temple lie in ruins? This is a question of priority. We just saw a question of procrastination. If you're looking for practical themes, there's a lesson about procrastination at verse 2. God's people have always been procrastinators. But we also have problems with priority. They're dwelling in paneled houses. In other words, they had taken the time to build their own houses and not just build something minor, but panel the houses and seal them up and have decent houses and did quite well with their houses. And yet the temple was lying in ruins. They gave emphasis to themselves and their comfort over the service of God. Make sense? Got a problem with priority. Now notice at verse 5. Here's a phrase used at verse 5, verse 7. What does he say? What does that mean? Yeah. Think about what you're doing. Think about what you're not doing. Think about the consequences of your action. Consider your ways. Consider changes that need to be made. Let's get ahead of ourselves. Look at verse 5. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Concentrate upon. Give deep thought to your ways. Now, verse 6 is an interesting picture. They've sown much, but bring in little. You eat, but you don't have enough. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. You clothe yourselves, but you have no warmth. You earn wages, and the earned wages you put in a bag with holes. You ever feel that way? Like you make money, and then you put it in your pocket, and you feel like your pocket's got holes. You just lose it all. I don't think he's talking about inflation here. What I think he's talking about is describing the emptiness of a life without God and the lack of priorities. Now let's get ahead of ourselves. Let's jump down to verse 9. The reason all of this is taking place, you tell me, verse 9. All right, yeah, the temple lies in ruins. God's not blessing them. Notice, let's get ahead of ourselves, verse 9, that you look for much and indeed you have little. He said, I blew it away. Why? Because my house is in ruins. In other words, because you weren't doing what you were supposed to, I was not blessing you. And so here is a life of giving emphasis to self without emphasis to God, and it's a life of emptiness. And so it ended up being this. They sow, and then they get very little back. They drink, but they're not filled. They're clothed, but they're not warm. They earn wages, and it's like putting their money in bags with holes, and it's gone. God said, I blew it away. I didn't bless you richly because you didn't give emphasis to me. That's an emphasis on life. It's an emphasis on life without God is the point. Make sense? Now again, you might make a note at verse 6. The reason for that is down at verse 9, because God had not blessed them. And then the reason God had not blessed them is because of the problem. Now, I want to go ahead and start at verse 9. I'm going to skip 7 and 8 on purpose. Let's go ahead and get 9 through 11. He said, you looked for much, and indeed you came to little when you brought it home. In other words, they're going out and they're sowing, and then they're coming back and they don't have anything. What was the reason? He said, I blew it away. Now, literally, did God blow it away? I think it's the idea that I didn't bless you. But it's like you come home with an armload of stuff, and when you get home, it's gone. Where'd it go? God just blew it away. God blew it out of your hands. Now, why is that? Because my house is in ruins while everyone runs to his own house. Again, priority. So now let's get verse 10. What's 10 and 11 say? Yeah, I withheld the dew. Very good. And the earth withholds its fruit. I brought a drought on the land, and the grain and new wine and whatever that brings forth on man and livestock and all the labors of your hand. So whether you were working or raising crops or you're raising animals, I didn't bless you richly. And so your animals didn't produce, your crops didn't produce, and I brought a drought and I brought a famine upon the land, and you were not richly blessed. And the reason is because you didn't do what you were supposed to be doing. I was not your priority. Now, let's stop and learn some lessons from that before we get into the challenge, verses 7 and 8. What have you learned so far? Either what's going on here or anything practical. Absolutely. There is an emptiness there. It's like you're grasping for wind. There's nothing there when you get it. And so you get money, and it's like it's gone through the hole. You get food, but then it doesn't satisfy. You drink, but it doesn't quench your thirst. I'm searching and looking for something, but nothing is satisfying. Materialism does that. It's not satisfying. I've known of very wealthy people who had no use for God who would later say that I have nothing. Now, they got a lot of material, but got money, millions perhaps, but they have nothing. This is all I've got is money. It's all gone, blown away. What else do you learn? Absolutely. I learned a lesson about priority. I learned a lesson about materialism. I learned a lesson about not obeying God. Now let's go to verses 7 and 8, the challenge now. Let's back up. And in the midst of this, here was the challenge. Consider your ways. And he says, go to the mountain and bring wood. In other words, they don't even have preparation made for the building of the temple. It's not like we're working toward it. We just haven't got to it yet. The material's not even on site. They laid the foundation, but they've got to go to the mountains and get wood and build the temple, and I will take pleasure in it and be glorified. You just do what I tell you, and I'm going to be glorified. Now, there seems to be a question whether that's true or not later in the mind of the people, but we'll get to that here in just a second. So there's the rebuke, there's the challenge. Let's start now at verse 12. What was the response? They obeyed. They did exactly. Now notice at verse 12, you see a reference to the remnant. At verse 12, you see a reference to the remnant at verse 14. You see a reference to the remnant later at verse chapter 2 and in verse, verse 4, I think. Anyway, there's a reference, there's always has been, always will be a remnant. But it's interesting that verse 12 said that Joshua and Zerubbabel and the remnant obeyed the voice and the words of Haggai the prophet, as the Lord their God had sent him to the people, and they feared the presence of the Lord. What do you make of that? Started with the leaders then rallied and said, you know what, we got to get busy. And so they start leading the people to get busy. And they obeyed what Haggai told them to do, because that was the word of the Lord. And it says they feared the presence of the Lord. All right? That's true. Absolutely. What that implies, and Ricky's onto something here, what that implies is that prior to this point, they were not fearing the Lord. Does that make sense? They're supposed to be God's people. They're supposed to be in fear of the name of God, stand in awe of God and be afraid of displeasing Him. They ought to be walking in the presence of the fear of God. But they had not been fearing God. So the text says they obeyed the voice, and implied is that they feared the presence of the Lord from this point forward. Prior to that, they were not fearing God. Interesting, Nehemiah says these people desire to fear your name a little bit later. So then Haggai's message spoke to them, saying that I am with you, says the Lord. There is a connection between fearing the presence of God and God being with us. God is not with those who don't fear His name. Does that make sense? It's interesting. Now here's some interesting phrasing in verse 14. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel and the spirit of Joshua and the spirit of the remnant, and they came and worked on the house of the Lord of hosts. How did God stir the spirit of Joshua, Zerubbabel, and the remnant? Context. Through His Word. Now, if God, and this miracles were present in the post-exile period, so could God have just miraculously somehow stirred them up? Yes, He could have done that, but that's not told in the text. What's implied in the text is this, that they heard the message and the word of the Lord from Haggai, they obeyed the voice, and then the text says it was stirred by two things. Number one, the preaching of the word, and the encouragement that I am with you. Does that make sense? That's the two things that had happened in the context. So can God stir our hearts today? Sure He can, through the preaching of the word and the encouragement that God is with us. All right, now that's going to be an important message. Now, interesting at verse 15, this is on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. And you say, okay, that's just telling the time. Well, that's 3.5 weeks from the time he started. And so why didn't they start immediately? Well, most suggest perhaps in that the text is saying they're obeying God, this maybe was time to prepare. Go back to chapter 1, and in verse 8, they had to go to the mountains and bring the wood. And so perhaps it takes time to prepare. If you decided tomorrow that you wanted to build a garage, just a simple project, you're probably not going to start tomorrow. There's some preparation that takes place, and it's going to take some time to get ready. It may be a week or 2 or 3 before you get started. Well, the same thing with building the temple, some time to prepare. But they got quickly at it, and so 3.5 weeks later, they're getting going. All right, now let's talk about the message of consolation about the glory of the temple. So in chapter 2, this is in the 7th month. This is a month and 3 weeks later. Haggai comes to Zerubbabel and to Joshua, and to the high priest and the remnant of the people. So he comes to the leaders and the remnant. And what's his question at verse 3? Yeah, who saw this in its former glory? Now, it's been 66 to 67 years, depending on the timing of the year. I'd have to go back and check. But anyway, we're at 66, 67 years. So that's not hard to remember. I can remember 60 years ago, but I can't remember 67. I'm not quite that old. But I can remember some events 60 years ago. Not vividly, but I can remember those. And so there were people then living who could remember back that 67, nearly 70 years ago, and remember when this temple was still standing. They remember what it looked like. There were others there that don't even remember. They were not born. And so the question is, who remembers that? And the question seems to be a discouragement on the part of the people. And you say, how do you say that? Because of the verses that follow. That whatever they're going to build, because of the depression of the day, that is, they don't have much materially, not like it was in the days of Solomon, that perhaps this building is going to be downsized. Perhaps they understand we cannot match the glory of that former temple. And so the question seems to be, should we even continue building? Should we even try to build this, since it's not even going to be close to that temple? It's going to be smaller, it's going to be less glorious. And will God be pleased with it? Now, let's just pause. If this were a movie, let's hit pause. Will God be pleased with this? We don't know the future yet, but how do I know so far from what's been said? He said he'd be with them. He's going to fill it with his glory. Look at verse 8, chapter 1. I will take pleasure in it and be glorified. God said he would. He said, you build my temple and I'll be glorified. I'll be pleased with it. And so that's what he begins to answer. So his point in verses 4 and 5 is God is with the builders. Notice three things now that he said. The first thing he says is, be strong. There's a key verse to this section. Zerubbabel, and be strong, Joshua, and be strong, all you people of the land. What does it mean to be strong? Take courage. Be courageous. Another way of wording that, notice he says at the end of verse 5, do not fear. Don't fear. Then verse 4, he tells them to work. Be courageous. But courage alone is not enough. Get in there and get to work. Get to building. And the third thing he says in that is, in verses 4 and 5, I'll be with you, that I'm the Lord of hosts. And notice at verse 5, according to the word that I coveted with you when I came out of Egypt, my spirit remains with you, do not fear. And so there's two things I want you to take note of at verse 5. At verse 5, he's referring probably to Exodus 29:45, where God had made the promise that I'll be with you and I'll go with you. Secondly, that implies God's carrying out his purpose and his plan for this nation. So the rebuilding of the temple and carrying on this nation and rebuilding here is carrying out this plan. I've made the promise and the covenant. I'm going to be with this nation. So don't fear. Now, so God, I'm going to be with you through the building of this. Now, verses 6 to 9, the glory of the temple will exceed the former. Now this, if we take it totally literally, there seems to be a contradiction, because who remembers the former temple? And the answer basically is, I remember it. This ain't going to match. This ain't going to be near that. And yet he says the glory of this is going to be greater than the former. And so what is he talking about? I think he's talking about the Messianic age. How do I know? Well, let's look at verse 6. For thus says the Lord of hosts, once more in a little while I will shake the heaven and the earth and the sea and the dry land. Now, just in interest of time, I just might mention, make a marginal note. Your text may have marginal notes, but take note of Hebrews 12:26. This is the only time Haggai is quoted in the New Testament, and he applies it to the Messianic age. God shaking the kingdoms, and as a result comes out the one kingdom that endures forever, verse 28, Hebrews 12. So the only time Haggai is quoted is this verse, and this is a questionable verse. I mean, it's a little confusing. We look at it and say, oh, what's this about? The Hebrew writer says this is talking about the Messianic age. So that's how I know. So this is talking about the days of the Messiah. That kingdom, that temple is going to far exceed this one in glory. That's where we're pointing. Verse 5 says that's where we're pointing. Verse 6 says that's where we're pointing. Now let's take this expression, the shaking of the kingdoms. It's used in Isaiah 13, Isaiah 24, but Isaiah 13, 10 and 13, Isaiah 24 uses similar language, Joel 2. It just talks about the upheaval of the nations, God ruling in the kingdoms of men. And God's going to do that. And he said, I'll shake all the kingdoms, and I will fill this temple with glory, says the Lord. I think that's twofold. He's going to fill this temple that's being built, but ultimately the temple that is described at verse 6, and that is the temple of Christ. And the glory of the latter temple shall be greater than the former, and in this place I will give peace. And so I know that's messianic. You say, how do you know? Hebrews 12 tells me so. All right. Now let's stop and footnote. This is very common in the prophets, as we've mentioned, that the prophets paint a darker picture in the backdrop, and growing out of that is a brighter future. The same thing is with Haggai. This seems like a dark picture. We're rebuilding the temple, but it's not anywhere going to be like the glorious temple of Solomon that has just been destroyed. Oh, coming out of that picture is a brighter picture of even a greater temple, far greater temple that exceeds in all the others. Now we've got to talk about the next section. Start at verse 10. Here's a message about prosperity. And so his first message here is the reasons for not being prospered. And he gives two illustrations. He says, go to the priest and ask, can something unclean be made clean by contact? So here is the priest, he has in his garment this something that's unclean. Can unclean be made clean by contact? And no. He's illustrating something. The second question is, can that which is clean be made unclean by contact? And the answer is yes. You say, what's the point? The point is, when I get to verse 14, so this people and so this nation before me, and so is every work of their hands, which they offer here is unclean. Here's the point. Merely coming back to the land did not make them clean. Merely building the temple does not make them clean. They have to change their heart in order to be clean before God. Does that make sense? That's his point. And so it's not some unclean people who have not been giving God priority. Just start building the temple and everything's okay. No. That's like someone who hasn't been attending and worshiping and serving God. Just start attending church and everything. No. You got to change your heart. Not just change your action. You got to change your heart. And that's the point. Now, beginning at verse 15, I know we're having to pick our pace up. What is 15 through 19 saying? Finish my sentence. When you do that, then I will bless you. All this prosperity that's been lacking, you change your heart as well as your actions, and I'm going to bless you. And he said, when the foundation was laid, since that time the foundation was laid, verse 16, he said you went to the, when you thought you were going to have 50 baths from the press and you found out you had 20. In other words, I struck you with mildew and hail and labors, and yet you did not turn to me. For the last 16 years, I've been giving you problem after problem, and you hadn't turned to me. You weren't giving me the priority. Consider now from this day forward, and then he gives the date of the 9th month and 24th month. Consider it. And his question now, is the seed still in the barn? And the answer, of course, is no. You see, the problem was that they hadn't sown, like in their crops. The problem was the seed was in the barn. Y'all just hadn't sown, and if you just sown, you'd have multiple production of crops. No. The seed had been sown. It just wasn't productive because God didn't bless them. That's the point. That's what the question is about the seed being in the barn. Is the seed still in the barn? No. It's been sown. The problem was they didn't obey God. And so from this day forward is the point that God's going to bless them. Now the last thing, and I know our time is gone, we got to quickly just mention this. This is a message of assurance about the future. And so verses 20 to verse 22 is a repeat of the principle of chapter 2, verses 6 to 9. God's going to overthrow the nations, the upheaval of the nations. Now, the last thing is there's hope through the Messiah preserved in Zerubbabel. This Zerubbabel is mentioned in two places in the New Testament. He's mentioned in Matthew 1:12 in the genealogy of Christ. He's mentioned in Luke 3:27 in the genealogy of Christ. So the hope for the future is preserved through this Zerubbabel, who is the governor. And he's in the lineage of Christ. Make sense? And so the future hope is preserved in the seed of this man, Zerubbabel. Make sense? And one last footnote, Jeremiah 22, verse 30 says, there was a decree that the descendants of Coniah, which includes Zerubbabel, would not sit on a throne in Jerusalem, which rules out any concept of Jesus sitting on a throne in Jerusalem. Cannot be. He cannot sit on the throne, and that principle be true. We're going to stop there. That's Haggai.